the way that I look at this journey through Southeast Asia and possibly the rest of the world, it's not just for the sake of having fun or trying to become a travel channel, right? What I really want this channel to start focusing more on is self-improvement, and not just fitness, all of self-improvement. And I wouldn't have come to that realization unless the vast majority of what I'm going to be talking about here are the ideas of some of the smartest people who have ever lived. And more specifically, these men are some of the wisest men who have ever lived. And I think a lot of people, a lot of guys especially, they're not really familiar with their works, because it requires, for the most part, it requires you to study a lot of philosophy, understand a lot of the jargon and stuff. But the ideas behind what they talk about in these texts really actually aren't that complicated. We can all apply it into our own lives. And that's our big mission of this channel, is to take some of the best and greatest ideas of some of the greatest men who have ever lived and put it in a practical, digestible format for the modern man. And what's really interesting is, when you guys who are in the manosphere, guys who are in the self-improvement space, they're always trying to really seek answers of okay, what does it mean to live a great life? Why do I care? And why does it matter for me to be good with women, for me to be confident in social situations? What's the point of all of this, right? Is it hopeless? Should I just rope max, bro? These ideas go through a lot of guys' heads, and I understand how self-improvement, this nebulous, abstract idea of making yourself better, it's what's the point of all of that, right? These ideas, it's very natural for you to sort of question, okay, why, what's the point of everything? What's the point of existing? What's the point of improving? Why, who cares if we're all gonna just die one day and the universe is pointless and whatever, I totally understand that, because I have went through that, and I still go through that myself in my own life. And what's really cool is instead of you trying to sit there and just try to figure all these things out, some of the smartest people who have ever lived have already basically given the best answers possible on these topics. It's just that it can get a bit confusing, because a lot of these people that I'm going to be talking about here, a lot of these guys, a lot of these men, I should say, they lived a long time ago, but the ideas that they came up with are so profound and so fundamental to addressing the human heart and the human condition that it doesn't matter what time period you live in, it's still going to be relevant. All right. So I'm going to present to you sort of what my interpretation of these things is, what it means to exist, what it means to live a great life, what it means to be a man, what it means to be happy in this video here. And if hopefully this resonates for you like it does for me. I'm not saying that this is a perfect thing, but this is what I specifically follow, and this is specifically the framework that I use to help guys out, whether they be my clients or just guys that ask me for help. And it's sort of the foundation of everything that I talk about on this YouTube channel. Alrighty, here we go. So here is the chart. Don't mind me if I'm looking down, I'm just looking at what you're looking at right now. So here's the chart right here. Now this probably looks quite complicated, and if you're reading it, you probably don't even know what half of these words mean. It's perfectly okay. I'm going to be explaining that to you here in this video. First, I want to shout out the great men of the past who have inspired this chart, who have completely changed my life in terms of how I view the world and how I can help guys out in their own life journeys. So without further ado, these guys are in no particular order: Friedrich Nietzsche, Aristotle, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Viktor Frankl, Carl Jung. There's also a few guys here and there, a few honorable mentions: William James, very underrated philosopher and psychologist. And there's also a few psychologists and self-help gurus, for lack of a better word, that have really inspired me as well. One is Benjamin Hardy, who wrote the book Willpower Doesn't Work. Another is Maxwell Maltz, who wrote the book Psycho-Cybernetics. There's a few other guys that I would like to shout out to, but those are all sort of the biggest influences. And if you're familiar with all of their works, then everything that I talk about here is going to make perfect sense. But, if you want to go that in depth, and that's great, but for most of you, it's, you probably don't need to go that in depth. So this is sort of the TLDR of a lot of their philosophies, and more specifically kind of connecting the dots between all of the things that they talked about and putting it into modern context. All right. So let's just start from the beginning here. So what's the whole idea? What's the whole point of life, right? What's the point of doing anything? Well, the simple answer is to be happy, right? You do all the different things that you do because you want to be happy. So what does happiness even mean? Well, for some people, happiness is just, them just feeling good, like carnal dopamine pleasure. A dopamine, or let's say a heroin addict, for example, he's probably not living a very, fulfilling life, but he's very happy in the moment that he's shooting up and he's just high out of his mind, right? But is that something that's honorable? Is that something we should strive toward, even though technically in that moment he's happy? I mean, hey, that's not for me to say, but I think for most people, they'll probably say that that's not the type of life that they want to live. So what's the problem with that? Well, that falls under the umbrella, that sort of dopaminergic, just trying to do what feels good in the moment. That falls under the umbrella of hedonia or hedonism, right? So a lot of people will say hedonism is bad. I don't necessarily think that's the case, and I'm going to present why I don't think that's the case here. But that sort of feeling is contrasted by this other lesser known feeling, because I'm sure most of you guys have heard of what hedonism is before. It's contrasted by this other feeling called eudaimonia. Now, eudaimonia, the Greeks especially, all had different ideas of what eudaimonia is, but basically it's sort of this constant feeling of fulfillment, right? So if you feel like you're doing like really fulfilling work, or you're doing exactly what you should be doing, that feeling, that sort of joy that you get, for example, if you've ever volunteered at a charity before. If you guys haven't volunteered at charities before, I highly, highly suggest that you do it. There's no better feeling than, just helping people out for free. It's really amazing. Highly, highly suggest. That's a bit more on the practical side of the types of things you should be doing in your life. I'll get to that a little bit later, but you probably get the point of what I'm saying. There's a certain feeling that you get that you just feel really good and fulfilled when you do good things. And that feeling is eudaimonia. Again, it's different from hedonia, where you just feel good because of these brain chemicals and dopamine and whatever that's going on. Eudaimonia is more that feeling of constant fulfillment, like you're on the right path and you're doing exactly what you should be doing. So the goal of life, in my opinion, is to try to constantly seek and strive toward that feeling of eudaimonia. And I think a lot of people, some people will actually say that that's not the goal of life. So fine, whatever. I mean, if you just want to be miserable and unfulfilled in your life, then hey, go for it. But for me, one of the things that sort of underlies human behavior, in my opinion, is something called emotivism, where human beings are primarily actually driven by their emotions. That's not a popular thing to say within the manosphere space, as in like, oh, well, men are rational, women are emotional. The psychological literature is actually very, very clear that all human beings are more emotional than they are logical. It's just that we tend to justify our emotional actions with logic, especially men. And logic is the one thing that actually sets us apart from other animals in the animal kingdom. But regardless, we're still emotional than we are rational. Now, that said, what's really cool is we can use our rationality and our ability to reason to put ourselves in the right situation where we can feel that fulfillment, that eudaimonic feeling of just like joy, like you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. You feel very fulfilled. And because of that, you're living the life that you want to live. So a lot of great thinkers, some of them have actually been pretty modern, have had sort of this idea of what it means to actually live a meaningful life, what it means to live meaningfully to the point where you achieve that feeling of eudaimonia, where you get rewarded with that feeling. Now, more recently, within the past century or two, the sect of philosophy called existentialism, otherwise known as philosophy turned inward. Another way of putting it is just to try to find meaning in a seemingly meaningless universe. A lot of great thinkers have talked about that. Guys who directly did call themselves existentialists, or guys who have kind of been grouped within that category, even though they didn't call themselves that. So in particular, the ones that I'm going to be covering in this video are Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Viktor Frankl. And then if we go way back in history, as in even before Jesus, someone who had a really good framework of achieving eudaimonia was Aristotle. Aristotle, in my opinion, is the greatest philosopher. He's the GOAT philosopher. There's nobody even close, because he literally just covered everything, and he's sort of like the grandfather of everything. You could argue maybe Plato too, but I think Aristotle, I'm biased, I think Aristotle is better than Plato. But anyway, that's for a whole other video. One thing that Aristotle is, I think his greatest contribution to philosophy, in my opinion, was a few different things. One, he actually just invented logic, right? So that's pretty based. But another thing too is he came up with this thing called virtue ethics. Maybe he's not the one that came up with it, but he's, as far as I know, he's like the first person that, like, you know, really popularized it, I guess. So the idea of virtue ethics is it's sort of an ethical system based on the moral goodness of the individual, and more specifically the Greeks, because you might think like, oh, well, moral goodness, I mean, that you can't help but think that that comes across as like sanctimonious or like holier than thou. What the Greeks thought was moral goodness is probably actually a little bit different than what you were taught in Catholic school, for example. But anyway, there's actually a lot of parallels between the two. Aristotle was very influential in Catholicism. But yeah, we're not going to get too much into that here. So the idea behind virtue ethics is that there's these certain virtues, and in Aristotle's belief, if you were aligned with these virtues, then that would actually give you that feeling of eudaimonia. And in Aristotle's worldview, you want to use your rationality and your reason to put yourself in the right circumstances to make sure that you become aligned with these virtues. Constant repetition and practice of these virtues through a process that Aristotle called habituation. You basically habituate yourself to these virtues, and then that actually just becomes who you are. Right? So for example, the virtue of courage. If you keep doing courageous acts over and over again, you by default become a courageous person. You're a brave person. You instead of running away from fear, you're always running toward it, right? But you're also being rational about it too, and you're not being an idiot about it, because then that would actually make you reckless. Speaking of recklessness, that's one of the excessive vices, which is sort of the excessive form of one of the virtues. It's sort of like going too far in one direction, as opposed to the exact opposite of that, which is the deficient vice, which isn't enough of a certain virtue. So for example, courage is the virtue, right, that we want to strive for. The deficient vice is cowardice, and then the excessive vice is recklessness. And so if you're currently more aligned with being a coward, you want to aim to become courageous. If you're more right now a reckless person, so you're not really scared of things, but you just think without acting, then you want to also become courageous. And so Aristotle talks about this in his work Nicomachean Ethics, where the cowardly man looks at the courageous man as being reckless. The reckless man looks at the courageous man as being a coward. Right? So your perception of what you should actually be is actually completely skewed. And so what you should do if you are a coward, for example, is to start acting a bit more recklessly, because your idea of being reckless is actually more accurately probably being courageous. The opposite is also true. If you're a very reckless person right now, you should probably start to act a little bit more cowardly, because what you think is cowardly is actually probably just the amount of cowardliness that you need in order to be courageous. And so if you're able to put these things together, if you're able to be aligned with these virtues, that is going to give you the feeling of eudaimonia. That's going to give you the feeling of fulfillment. So that's one way to achieve eudaimonia. That was kind of like the original thought of what it meant to be happy. In Aristotle's view, what it means to be happy is to be virtuous, right? Now, look, he could be wrong there. I think it's kind of like a pretty simplistic definition of like what it means to be happy. If you just are a man of high moral character, then you're automatically going to be happy. You know, that could be the case. That could not be the case. Who knows? It's regardless of that, you should still strive to be virtuous, or at the very least be aligned with those virtues, because, and I'm going to get to this next part here, this is where we transition into the existentialism we were talking about. Because let's just say, for example, that simply being virtuous isn't enough for you to live a nice, great, fulfilling life. Well, that's perfectly okay, because what it does then is it equips you with what you need in order to actually find meaning in your life. And this is where the existentialist ideas start to come in. So let's say, for example, right, that life is a video game. So in the video game of life, if you're starting off with like a super stacked character, like you see all the stat points and the skill points and it's like all maxed out, you're probably going to have a better shot of getting to the final part of the game and beating the game, right? As opposed to if you look at your skill tree and your skill points of your character at the beginning of the video game, and it's like the lowest settings, like you barely have any skill points or whatever, the chances of you beating the video game at the end are going to be lower. So assuming that virtue ethics on its own doesn't give you that feeling of fulfillment and happiness, what it does do then, and I think this is undeniable, is it gives you the best shot to put yourself in the right positions to actually find and have a meaningful life. In particular, the very first virtue that Aristotle talks about in Nicomachean Ethics is courage. And I don't think that that's a coincidence, because if you aren't courageous, if you're too scared, if you let fear control your life, you're not going to act. You're not going to do things. Aristotle believed that courage was a virtue. Plato believed that courage was a virtue. Nietzsche believed that courage was a virtue. You know, all of these different great philosophers, they all had their disagreements with one another, but they all agreed on the fact that a courageous person, a brave person, somebody who acts despite being fearful, overcomes their fear and does the damn thing anyway, that is an admirable human being. And so this leads me next to my favorite philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche has this, he's so famous for all these different quotes and stuff because he's like the smartest guy that ever lived. I'm going to try to not simp for him too much in this video. But one of the prescriptions that he has that I think is so profound is he says that you should live dangerously. So what the hell does live dangerously even mean? Does that mean that you should just be like a freaking idiot, and just go YOLO it without a thought? No, not necessarily. It should be that you perceive something as dangerous because you're scared of it, right? But even though you're scared of it, you know that you should go do it, right? And your ability to live dangerously is very much going to be tied to how much of a virtuous person you are. So Nietzsche was like the Giga Chad of philosophers, maybe not in his own life, but in terms of his mentality. He thought what made a man honorable is somebody who attempted to do great things. He actually refers to his readers as that, as the attempters, as the philosophers of the future, the men who are going to carve the path for the Übermensch. I'm not going to get too much into the idea of the Übermensch and stuff here, but basically he writes for people who are daring enough to be different, daring enough to carve their own paths through life. He called these people the higher men, or like I said, the attempters, the philosophers of the future. If you want a more in-depth overview of Nietzsche's philosophy, more specifically the idea of the Übermensch and that type of stuff, I'm going to link a video somewhere here around my head. It's about a 2-hour stream that I did covering Nietzsche, more specifically the prologue to Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's my favorite stream that I've ever done. Highly suggest you go watch it. I poured my heart and soul into it, and it's the best stream that I've done. So anyway, why is it important to live dangerously? Well, when you live dangerously, you put yourself in new opportunities. You put yourself in new environments. And the more environments and more situations that you put yourself in, the higher chance that you can find meaning in your life. So a perfect example of this, right? Like, let's say, for example, let's take a thought experiment and say that, hey, you were never able and never allowed to leave your house. If you stepped out of your house, God himself will smite you on the spot. So you never left your house. Do you think somebody like that would be able to find deep meaning in his life? Probably not, because he has such limited life experiences. The odds that the limited life experiences that he has, that he's going to be able to find meaning in that is very low, as opposed to if you have tons of life experiences, then the odds of you finding meaning in your life is going to be a lot higher. So how exactly do you find meaning in your life? Is it something that you just chase down? Can you just logic your way into it? No, I don't think that you can. That's something that Dostoevsky and Viktor Frankl, more specifically, didn't really believe that you can find meaning in life. In fact, what actually happens is you live life, you pay attention to your surroundings, and then the meaning of life ends up actually finding you. So this is sort of a central theme to Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which is him recounting his tale of surviving through the Holocaust. So, he was going through the worst things imaginable, seeing his friends and family die and all the horrific things that happened in the Holocaust. And obviously, when you're put in such a terrible situation like that, you can't help but think, what is the point of all this? What's the point of all this suffering? And so I can't exactly do justice to that terrific book. Highly suggest that you read it. But I can do justice to one of the people that he is heavily inspired by and quotes a lot in his book, which is Fyodor Dostoevsky. So Dostoevsky is arguably the greatest author of all time. And he has so many great books and everything. I haven't even read all of them yet myself, but there is one specific story, this one short story that he wrote that honestly, every single time I read it, I still like, I come to tears, honestly. It's so beautiful and so profound. So that book is called The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. There's actually a free audio version here on YouTube. It's a very short read. It's only like an hour long. I'm going to link it somewhere in the description. Highly suggest that you go listen to it after this video. So I'm not going to spoil it too much here, but the central idea behind The Dream of a Ridiculous Man is, you know, it tells a tale of a guy who's contemplating suicide. He thinks that, oh, the entire world is pointless. Like, what's the point of all this? Life sucks, right? He's just kind of being like a doomer. And as he's doing that, a young girl comes up to him saying like, hey, I can't find my mom. Please help me. I'm scared. And meanwhile, this guy, you know, he's still like, he's so nihilistic about whatever. He's just like, go away, little girl. Like, whatever, you know, I'm focusing on how much my life sucks here and how everything's pointless. And so long story short, again, I don't want to spoil it for you. The main character kind of goes through this entire journey of finding out like what the meaning of life actually is. And he kind of comes to the conclusion that at the end of the story, that little girl, that was the meaning in his life, right? He was sitting there wondering and being like, what's the meaning of life? What's the point of all this? When in reality, the meaning of life was standing there right in front of him and he denied her. And so think about this within your own lives, you know, like you might be thinking to yourself, oh, what's the point of all this? Life sucks, whatever. This is terrible. When in reality, there's probably somebody who needs you right now in this moment that you hadn't considered, right? And you should go and help them. And that's going to help give you meaning. That's going to help give you that feeling of eudaimonia. Now, is this me saying like, hey, you should just drop everything and go to charity or whatever, just dedicate your life to a certain charity? I mean, for some of you that might be good, but for a lot of us, that's probably not necessarily the case. But regardless of that, the whole idea of living dangerously, the whole idea of becoming virtuous, to build up your stat points, your skill points, your avatar, your character, that's what you want to start off with virtue ethics, and then try to live dangerously so that you have a bunch of life experiences. And hopefully, ideally, as you're living a bunch of life experiences and living dangerously, that sort of meaning finds you. So, you know, you're probably not going to have some little girl come up to you asking for help, but for all you know, you just trying to go out there and adventure and live life to the fullest, somehow that sort of meaning will find you. And this is exactly what happened to me like 3 years ago now, for example. You know, I knew that I wanted to live adventurously. I knew that for some reason, something was calling me to just, you know, pack up all my shit and just move to Asia and just YOLO it, right? I didn't know why, but I had this feeling that I had to just go do it. And at the time, I was just a fitness trainer and that was it. And when I was over there, I started to get way more into self-development, self-improvement. And then I realized I only loved fitness because it was an aspect of self-improvement. The actual thing that drove me and gave me joy when I would help my clients out is the self-improvement, the overall developmental aspect. And the way that I look at this journey through Southeast Asia and possibly the rest of the world, it's not just for the sake of having fun or trying to become a travel channel, right? What I really want this channel to start focusing more on is self-improvement, and not just fitness, all of self-improvement. And I wouldn't have come to that realization unless I was courageous enough to actually just pack up my shit and move halfway around the world. So by acting courageously, by acting virtuously, by really just trying to do daring, cool new things, by treating life like an adventure, you increase the odds of meaning finding you. And to bring it back to Viktor Frankl believed that the central drive of human beings is something called the will to meaning. Whereas people like Sigmund Freud, for example, he thought that the central drive of human beings was their libido. And Friedrich Nietzsche believed that it was something called the will to power, which I kind of personally believe in myself, and I think the will to meaning could be an extension of will to power. That's for a whole separate other video. I'm not going to cover that today. But I think it makes sense, even from a Nietzschean point of view. Nietzsche has a famous quote where he says, I think it was in the Genealogy of Morals, that man not only doesn't mind suffering, but actually welcomes it, provided there's a meaning for it. So yeah, I mean, think about all the different things like that, all the hardships that you're willing to go through as long as there's some sort of meaning behind it. So let's take fitness, for example. Well, when you're working really hard in the gym and abstaining from certain foods and dieting and, going through the crucible that is body recomposition and just revolving your entire life around trying to look better, well, that is a form of suffering, right? Constantly monitoring your foods, doing cardio and huffing and puffing, doing a bunch of tough reps and having your muscles feel sore. That's a form of suffering, but you welcome that suffering because there's meaning behind it. The meaning in this scenario is that you make gains as a result. And so I think the case to say that the central drive of human beings is the will to meaning, I think there's a very strong case to be made there. Especially when you're doing something meaningful, you are rewarded with that feeling of eudaimonia. That's sort of the drive. And I understand that that's sort of like an epistemic foundation of all the things I'm talking about, is that human beings are fundamentally emotional creatures who are driven and largely driven to chase after that feeling of eudaimonia, that feeling of fulfillment. And you get that feeling of fulfillment, that feeling of eudaimonia by living a meaningful life. And so regardless of if the answer is virtue ethics to get the eudaimonic feeling, or for you to find something meaningful, regardless of that, focusing on virtue ethics, focusing on becoming a better man, a more virtuous person, is going to help you down the path to find more meaning, because it increases your capacity to live dangerously, or just the being aligned with the virtues themselves already gives you that feeling. Regardless, the solution is to focus on your own character development, to try to achieve the golden mean. So how exactly then does one achieve the golden mean? So if you're guilty of all these deficient vices, for example, how do you shift over to become congruent with these virtues so that you can actually live a meaningful life? The solution to that, in my opinion, is something called shadow integration, which is a concept, idea, I don't know what you would call it, a framework that Carl Jung came up with. At the very least, I mean, some people say he didn't come up with it. Some people actually say Nietzsche came up with it in a way, but he very much popularized it and went really in depth with it. And bro, I don't even know where to begin with shadow work, because it's very complicated. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. And honestly, it's really the only form of self-help and self-improvement that I think actually works, because it forces you to address your fears head on. I'm going to be covering these topics a lot more in the future. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, and part 2 to this video will be coming out soon. I really love covering philosophy on this channel, but the reality is, as a YouTuber, as an influencer, whatever the fuck you want to call it, you have to kind of make content based on what your audience wants to see. So if you really enjoyed this, please tell me in the comments that this is something that you really want to see more of. That'll help motivate me and remind me that this is the type of content that y'all actually see and want to enjoy, and this is the content that I love making. This is the stuff that drives me. This is the stuff that gives me that feeling of eudaimonia. It's very fulfilling, and I'm very thankful to each and every one of you who really actually appreciate these types of videos. And I would love nothing more than to continue to create this type of content. But it's going to be tough for me to do that if there's not a demand for it. So if you haven't liked the video already, please like it. If you feel like you can share this video with somebody, please share it. And leave comments down below to tell me your actual thoughts on this. And if you guys really like this content, I will be more than happy to continue making stuff like this. So thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you, especially if you watched to this part of the video. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.